morning. Good morning. I'm just jumping in, bringing in my team, bringing in Jenni into the room, and then we'll get stuck right in. Yay. Here we go. Promote to panelist for Jenni. And great to see you on this gorgeous spring Friday morning. Jenni and I are meeting each other in different time zones for this first week of, was it the same last Friday?
No, it happened on the weekend. I forgot that it even changed until my calendar said messy middle was at 6:30. I was like, what? What is this messy middle at 6:30? No, it's not at 6:30.
That Queensland's the only state that doesn't do.
No, because they thought that daylight saving would the cows wouldn't know when to come in to milk, and that would actually cause the shades to fade. We're an incredibly clever state with some very interesting policies.
I love it. That's so funny. Here we go. Hang on. I'm just promoting to panelists.
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see everybody here. Charles, nice to see you. Macy, Brenda.
Hi, everyone. I'll just click on Let's Go Live. Maybe, do you want to do the introductions this morning, Jenni?
I'd love to do the introductions. Good morning, everybody. I am Jenni Walke from Elephant in the Room Consulting. I'm very excited to be here on Bite Size Conversations with Kylie Mowbray-Allen, my digital BFF from Hello Media. How are you, Kylie?
Great. Thank you, Jenni. Very nice to be seeing you this morning. How are you?
I'm amazing. I've had an awesome week. I've had lots of really fun things that have happened this week. I was on the radio yesterday talking about Indigenous businesses and mentoring, which is so much fun. So some really cool things are happening. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today, 1 week into Indigenous Business Month. And what about your week? How has your week been?
It's been a super interesting week. I do love a public holiday.
I know, it throws everyone out.
So I really enjoyed having Monday off, and I had an amazing day. I went on the Byron Bay Eco Cruises cruise up the Brunswick River, and they've been my clients for many, many years. And they invited me on the boat, and I took my brother. So we had a beautiful little sunset cruise afternoon with a Brookie's gin and some little snacks.
Amazing.
Just the most stunning afternoon, but I'm still sunburnt from that, because of course I took a hat and didn't wear it. But aside from that, I think that's just a beautiful way to start the week. I'm thinking I need Mondays regularly.
Well, we had a good week, of course, because Panthers won the grand final, and we were one of the lucky few, or lucky many, who got to go. So my partner, who's been a diehard Panthers fan for most of his life, or all of his life, got to see his team play a phenomenal game on Sunday in Brisbane, which, you know, is never probably going to happen again. So it was that starting the week saying anything is clearly possible when the AFL grand final is played in Western Australia and the NRL grand final is played in Brisbane. That never happened. So you can, anything that you thought was not possible obviously is. So what's holding you back is what I say.
I think that's brilliant. Anything is possible. And you know what I've also really loved about this week? That in my group coaching and in my one-on-one coachings with my clients from Sydney, there's a totally different vibe about them. Everyone's feeling excited and enthusiastic about business and just about life, because of course they're coming out of lockdown next week.
Isn't it? Someone was saying it's Freedom Day on Monday or something.
Yeah. So it's quite a different feeling and a different vibe I'm finding, and it's quite uplifting, and it's good. It's so good. So yeah, again, I love that line. Anything is possible.
Absolutely.
So speaking of anything is possible, this week we're talking about Indigenous Business Month, which clearly we've got a lot to learn from you with that. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that topic. So firstly, how about you share, what is Indigenous Month?
So Indigenous Business Month was actually started a couple of years ago by some alumni from the Melbourne Business School Murrah program. And essentially it's a month to celebrate and recognise and acknowledge and engage with Indigenous businesses around Australia, because it's a huge market, it's a huge growing industry, and not just in the traditional art and culture and that kind of more traditional Indigenous business sectors, but actually looking at Indigenous business and saying, how can we actually improve our impact? How can we actually add value, and leaning in and seeing what's out there. So there are some incredible businesses in the market at the moment that I have the privilege of working with, that in the digital space, in logistics and IT and security, in, you know, resourcing and construction and recruitment. Pretty much, if you can imagine, if any industry exists, there is an Indigenous business within that industry. So we're a little bit quiet sometimes about telling people what that is. So Indigenous Business Month is about promoting that and boosting the economy by engaging with Indigenous businesses.
So Jenni, with your own business, Elephant in the Room Consulting, how do you then promote yourself this month in a different way and put your hand up and say, hi, I'm an Indigenous business and this is Indigenous Business Month? Do you do that yourself, or how does that work?
It's a really good question. I actually have only just leaned into it in the last couple of years, to be perfectly honest. When I started my business, for me, being Indigenous, I can't change, right? It's in my skin, it's in my blood. I can't remove that part of my identity. But I didn't want, when my business to start, to be purely identified as an Indigenous business, which is a pretty sad thing to say, because a lot of people have that view of Indigenous business as coming from a point of, well, isn't it great that they're a business? How lucky are they? It's so wonderful, in that kind of almost slightly patronizing tone. So I was like, I'm just going to be a really good business owner. I'm going to go really good work, create impact. And you know what? I also happen to be Indigenous. So if you've got some money to spend in your Indigenous procurement policy, send it my way. So I had that kind of attitude of, I'm just like any other business. But what I've recognized is that people are starting to be more mindful and aware of how they spend their money and their procurement money. And they're looking to create impact in more than just delivery of programs. And using Indigenous businesses is a really clever way of doing that. Because as we were talking before this, kind of off air, if you like, around Indigenous businesses and the way that the money is spent within the Black economy tends to circulate more. There are you're 6 times more likely to have an Indigenous business start at the moment than a non-Indigenous business. We're a growing sector. And the money spent in our industry actually impacts community, impacts long-term well-being and other plans, because we spend that money within the community. And so I think it's an opportunity now for us to say, if you work with an Indigenous business, you're not just actually getting an amazing product or an amazing outcome, you're also having a social impact. And that's something that people are really interested in doing these days.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I was going to say, Jenni, something you said to me earlier was about how it's fascinating to me how people, Indigenous businesses will spend it within their community, as opposed to the way other businesses will spend it. Where so much of it's going offshore, et cetera, et cetera. So how is that money being spent, and how can we get in on that?
Well, I think it's just about saying, well, if you're spending money, and let's just say something, and I had this conversation with a colleague and client earlier this week. If you're spending money on gloves, right? If you've got PPE and you're a company who's selling money on gloves, there are a million different providers probably in the world on gloves. But if you're spending that money and you've got a business that's buying them offshore, and basically the money is all going offshore, and you've got a company who can provide them to you in Australia, that is owned by an Indigenous person, run and managed and produced here in Australia, and they can price guarantee you, wouldn't you want to work with a company that's going to keep the money in Australia, boost their economy and increase the employment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, versus sending that money offshore? So it's simply saying, how do I spend money that I'm already spending in a better way for the economy? Same conversation we had when Dick Smith was around about Buy Australian Made. And I had this conversation yesterday saying, there was all that Buy Australian Made product piece, but we weren't really yet ready to want to spend that slightly extra money on Australian made. And I think now the society is starting to recognise, with the improvement of ESG, so the kind of requirements for companies to be more environmentally friendly, more sustainable, and really mindful about their impact, working with local and Indigenous businesses is a really great way to create sustainable change across the Australian economy, as well as within Indigenous communities.
So it's super interesting, isn't it? Because I was just talking with a client last night who has 3 toy shops. So, and they're very much about natural toys, and they still have Lego and whatever, but very much about natural, sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. And we were talking about lead magnets and all that other wonderful stuff, and how the wooden toy thing, like we were looking at one of the products on her website, it's $300, And now Kmart's got on the bandwagon of wooden toys, but wooden toys are not the same. So wooden toys that have been, where the wood is sustainably sourced, where it's not coated in stuff that's toxic, where it's, I don't know, who's made it, where is it made, all that kind of stuff, compared to a $5 wooden doll's house, or, that's a little exaggeration there, but you know what I mean? Yeah. So not all things are equal, even though they may appear that on the surface. And where we choose to spend our dollars. And I just watched a reel on Instagram this morning by Mia Friedman. It was quite curious. I've never actually watched one of her reels, but there she was doing her makeup, getting ready for the day. And I was like, wow, there you go. Anyway, she was talking about her clothes and what she was wearing, and how she's got a lot of flack from wearing something that's $300 and promoting that, whereas most people can't be spending $300 on a pair of tracksuit pants. But she was explaining why she does it. And she said, because I want to promote women-owned businesses here in Australia. So when you think about those $300 pants, it's true, most people may not be able to afford $300 pants, but I want you to think about the cost of those pants, as opposed to $3 pants from Big W or Kmart or whatever like that. Yep. Who's benefiting from it? Where's the money coming from? Plus, when you look at those giant corporations, when they're producing 500,000 units of one thing, as opposed to a small business owner here in Australia that at most would be producing maybe 300 units of one thing, or businesses where it's all handmade. Of course, you've got to pay a bigger price, but the cost is worth every penny, because you're impacting so many different people in so many different ways and creating change. And just like you said with Indigenous businesses, that money is then getting spent within a community. It's not going off overseas and, just to big corporations. So I think we just need to think about it in so many different ways.
Yeah. And I think part of the challenge is that when we're looking at Australian made and women-led businesses, we're all talking about essentially minorities in the global market, right? So even Australian made in a global market is a minority niche, because it's made here so people are wanting how cool it is to have an Australian made product, even in the US, because there's a tax associated with that, because it's unique and it's niche and it's a little bit kind of quirky. Women-led business is the same. Any business that is run by essentially a minority group needs to be supported. But Indigenous businesses, I think, it takes it a little bit further, because the economy and many of the people within the communities, and I've been blessed. I'm not going to pretend to say that I've had a really hard life. I've been absolutely blessed with the opportunities that my family, that my mother and my father presented to me, and I've wanted to take those. So I've got an incredible business. I've also worked for it, right? But there are many people who don't have that same role model about being in business, or may not have had the opportunities. And that's legacy issues around Australian policy. And you were talking off air about the White Australia policy and all those different things that have actually created gaps in the way people have had access to education, access to training, but just that confidence to be able to go out and do it without feeling shame, without feeling worried that they're going to be judged for it. And so engaging with Indigenous businesses is helping break that cycle. It's helped breaking transgenerational trauma from policies that have, from 20 or 30 years ago. It's helped changing the way people feel about themselves. It's giving opportunity for people to work in their community, for their community, by doing work remotely, by promoting businesses at that local level. So I think that it changes the way that we consider, why would I spend $1 with you? Because $1 with that business with me, with other Indigenous businesses, means that we indirectly support our communities. Now, what that looks like is different to everybody, right? Some people do it with community programs. Somebody do it with mentoring. I do it by providing really either low bono or free mentoring for Indigenous businesses when they come to me, if they're in that startup phase, because that's my give back. There's ways that we do that, but it's a choice for us to improve ourselves, improve our economy, and break those cycles, which will hopefully in 15, 20 years, we won't have to have an Indigenous Business Month, because those levels will be changed, and we'll actually be able to reset the bar so that, there is equality across everybody.
Yes. So before we came on, I just Googled Indigenous Businesses Australia, and up came shopping, which was fantastic. There was so much going on there. I was blown away. But then I started delving into it and realized actually what they were showing me, a lot of the stuff was just inspired by Indigenous things rather than necessarily Indigenous owned businesses. So how do you think, other than Googling and then going down a rabbit hole, how do you think that, or how can we find Indigenous businesses to support?
There are lots of actually connection points. There's IBA, there's Supply Nation, which is one of the nation's kind of first peak industry body, I guess, for Indigenous businesses. They actually do a certification process for Indigenous businesses. So you can register if you're an Indigenous business, but if you actually want to be certified, you need to actually show that you're managed and owned, and the financial control and the flow and effects rest with the Indigenous person. So that prevents things like black cladding, which is a thing, which is where basically non-Indigenous businesses engage with an Indigenous person as their front person. They get a small wage, but the actual revenue and the financial gain and the economic development opportunities actually flow out of the community and not to the Aboriginal community. It's literally just cluttered with an Indigenous person. So there's a lot of organisations that actually really focus on doing that. So Black Business Finder, there's a website called Black Business Finder. It's BBF, it's here in Queensland. But also reaching out through, if you literally search Indigenous businesses on Instagram, so many incredible businesses within Instagram. If you literally type hashtag Black business or Indigenous business or First Nations businesses, they'll actually come up with a huge amount of searches on Instagram and on Facebook. But what we want to think about, though, is who are you spending with, and asking some questions. And it's okay if you're just buying a pair of earrings, then the amount of due diligence you might need to ensure that it's Indigenous business is a little bit less than if you're putting a large contract out to market. And I think it's when you're looking at a big contract and want to engage with an Indigenous business, it's asking the question, where does the money go? Who actually has control of the company? They're the questions I got asked to show that, yes, I'm an Indigenous business. It's run by me. It's owned by me. I'm the controller of the finances. I manage the business operations. So it's truly it's 100% Indigenous owned. And asking those questions and having that conversation shows that not only are you interested in where, what the impact is that's being created, but it also means that if more people ask those questions, it's going to actually remove the opportunity for things like black cladding or other businesses to actually, essentially ride the coattails of the Black business kind of economy and the movement at the moment.
I'm really fascinated by this Black business coattails. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, I think it's a funny thing is, so often there's a
token gesture.
Well, it is very much a token gesture. So many people be like, oh, it's the kind of back in the day, and you watch movies where you say, oh, look, I'm so woke, I have a black friend, woohoo. Well done you. Guess what? I have a white friend. What is the alternate? Like that kind of old school kind of paternalistic idea of, oh, look, I bought something because I wanted to help them out. Well, hang on. You needed it. We had it. We sold it to you. That's like any other business, but it's often produced in that kind of paternalistic, I'm trying to help you out kind of way. Often what happens is, because there's a movement at the moment with Indigenous procurement and a real recognition that we need to actively do something as a whole society to break that cycle that occurred as a result of past policy. Those policies existed. We can't deny it. They happened, and the impact is still being felt today by Indigenous communities. So by working with an Indigenous business, it's actually proactively finding a way, not paternalistically, but actually saying, I'm going to spend my money in a really positive and sustainable way that's going to help you and help the whole of Australia kind of break down some of those stereotypes. As a result of that, though, people go, oh, I know, I'll partner with a Black business or an Indigenous business, First Nations business, whatever you want to call yourself. And then I will actually get access to that pool of money that's often set aside. They actually put in government, they actually have set asides for Indigenous businesses so that they can actually actively promote that. So having a non-Indigenous business kind of go, well, let me partner with you, I'll support you, and they essentially back the business. So that, yes, to some extent it helps boost the Indigenous business, but really they're there to get access to funds that were really designed for Indigenous businesses.
Interesting. And would you mind sharing, mate, you can be honest and say, no, I don't want to, but you told me a little story before that I just thought was great about the pub.
Oh, well, yeah, we were talking earlier because a lot of people. No, well, it's funny. Like my cousin does it in a funny way. Like we were talking off for those people who are listening who may not realize some interesting fun facts that while, if we think about apartheid in in South Africa, we often kind of are repelled by the idea of apartheid segregation, like it never happened. but the policies in Australia here started in sort of early 1900s of apartheid and segregation. We had it here in Australia, and it actually extended all the way through to probably early 80s as a policy of the government. And so, and in fact, I was told by someone else that that it was actually the South African government came to Queensland to see how this segregation and apartheid policy worked before taking it back to South Africa. So we've had this policy in place. And so my cousin grew up down in northern New South Wales and was at a pub out the back with his white girlfriend. So he was a paler skinned Aboriginal man, kind of like me, a bit darker than me though, and was out the back of the pub having a conversation, you know, with his then girlfriend. And the bartender kind of came out and said, "Oh, look, we just want to let you know this is the black side of the bar. So, you know, you want to make sure that, you know, just there's no one here now, but, you know, the black fellas are going to be coming in later. So just be mindful. You might want to move out the front to the, you know, with your girlfriend because you're not really sure how they're going to be around her." And then, of course, this is his community. He is a black fella. It's technically he's on the right side of the bar from that perspective. And so when his cousins came and family came and he was, you know, big shout out and having, you know, big hugs and jokes, and they were joking around with his girlfriend, the bartender was like, "Oh my God, I am so embarrassed," because he kind of went, "Oh, you actually want to hang out with these people?" Like it was very much that segregation of it's not safe to be with black fellas. It's not safe to be there. And that's the reality. That's not trying to be overly, trying to be, trying to be overly dramatic about it. That was the reality of so many people in that kind of mid-century of Australia and into the 70s and 80s, not even just mid-century, but 70s and 80s, that stuff happened. And we're still feeling the effects of that. And I think the black community and Indigenous communities in Australia are still trying to find ways out of that. And is that I've been blessed, but there are so many others who haven't had that opportunity to step out of some of those old stereotypes or some of those old engagements, particularly if they're still living in the same communities where those policies existed in the 70s and 80s, you know, so they're still, the community doesn't forget. And the local people who've been there all their life, they don't forget either.
Gosh, it's an
incredibly complex subject. And so I guess,
sure is.
And I think the thing is though, we need to find ways to have this open narrative. And I think that's what Indigenous Business Month does. It provides an opportunity if people want to lean into a conversation and discuss things like this and say, hey, what does it actually mean? Is to do it with a true intention of saying, I want to learn, I want to understand, so I can understand and make a decision myself as to whether I want to support this. And if you don't want to support an Indigenous business, that's okay. I'm not going to judge you. That's your choice. But you have to have all the information and understand what the history is to understand why the value exists now. And the more relaxed we have about it, make a bit of fun about it, it opens the door for people to ask questions. And that's actually what creates learning. And that's what allows us to move forward.
Indeed. And Jenni, I think the fact that there are so many more films and documentaries and TV series coming out, like I know I've mentioned it before, but I really found the Adam Goodes story just so moving. But I went with my whole family, which was great. And we all walked out of there going, well, we need to talk about this a lot more. That was a really fascinating experience. But also, you know, the TV shows like Redfern Now, and, you know, there's stuff out there. So we can all be learning and educating ourselves. There's even one I watched recently. I can't remember. I found it on a streaming thing, but about set in the 60s in King's Cross in a maternity hospital. I cannot remember the name of it, but there's an Aboriginal girl in that. She's a glorious actress. I love her. But it's so fascinating following her storyline and things of what things would like back then. So the more that it's there, that we can see it and really understand it, or even just get a feel for what was going on and then go off and do our own searching journey, etc. But I really love that you said, you know, when I said about the Google search just wasn't coming up with the right thing, but then you said actually look up the hashtag on Instagram, because yes, wow, that's so much more powerful. So I put that as a challenge to everyone this morning to jump on Instagram, go and look those hashtags up and see who you can follow and see what you need to buy.
and essentially what it is, I mean, we have small businesses that we're talking, and I guess we promote Indigenous Business Month in the same way that they have Small Business Month in Queensland, and they have, you know, Mental Health Awareness Month, or all the different months are literally designed to raise awareness. It's about to say, hey, there's a whole economy that exists. But what I find really fascinating is at the moment, even in the absent, even with COVID, many Indigenous peoples are starting to realize this is an opportunity for us to stay at home, stay in community, but actually create a business around our idea, because we're comfortable with Zoom now. Before, we had to go into an office, and if I didn't want to leave my community, if I didn't want to leave my home and my country, then I couldn't go. I didn't want to go and actually do that. I didn't want to have to go into the big city to get a job. They don't have to now. There's opportunities for kids right now who are 18, 20, 25, 40, who can use social media to become a VA, to become, to start a social media company, to work for a social media company, to do some online training in digital marketing like you guys do, or graphic design, or something that allows them to create a business that allows them to share who they are, where they live, or develop skills without having to leave. And I think that's what, and so I think the last report I saw is that in the last 10 years or 5 years, it's been a 6-fold increase to one of Indigenous businesses to non-Indigenous businesses at the moment, because we're recognizing and starting to see and embrace those opportunities and letting go of some of that shame. And if we fail, we fail. It doesn't matter. Whereas a lot of other businesses, like a lot of other people are going, no, it's not the right time. And so I think embracing the opportunity now gives us as a society to say, let's actually all start leaning into these conversations and get to a point where I don't have to say I'm an Indigenous business. I don't have to start with that. I just happen to be a Bundjalung woman who owns a business. And that's how it should be. You're a New Zealand woman who owns a business. And that's who you are. That's our identity. Can't change that, and so let's embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've just loved this conversation with you this morning, Jenni. Thank you so much for sharing, and especially that wee story about your cousin.
I know, it's pretty funny.
I think for all of us, we can go out there and do a bit more research, get a bit more understanding, and also go and find those hashtags.
Yeah.
And follow the hashtags, find some great accounts, and support some Indigenous businesses because you can and because you should. That's really the main reason.
The bottom line.
And we all need to think a lot more about where we spend our money, how we spend our money, and why we spend our money.
That's exactly, and that's essentially what I'm with you, Kylie. They're the three things that we want to ask. If we let's create impact with what we do, rather than just not worry about where we spend our money. Let's actually start considering what's going to create the greatest impact, not only for them but for us. Like, there's so many incredible things happening that we kind of don't think about, because again, it's not in our frame of reference. So it's time to start taking the blinkers off and to actually start embracing the whole society and the whole community and seeing what's out there.
Oh, absolutely. I just love that. Thank you, Jenni.
Oh, my pleasure. This has been so much fun for me. And anyone wants to chat, look, I'm happy to have a conversation about this anytime. And I'm hoping the conversation has been, not that it has to be easy, because it's sometimes uncomfortable is also good, but the idea is to have these conversations and not be shy about the conversations.
Jenni, I just realized we've gone over time, but I've got one question that I want to
ask. We have two, as always.
If I just ask you one more question, and that is, I want you to talk about the word black. And use the word black. So, for example, black's a big thing in America, Black Lives Matter and hashtag Black business, etc. When you brought up before about Black business, and I thought, we're likely to get a whole lot of American stuff flooding us. Why is it that in some places it feels okay to say black and in some places it doesn't? And who should be allowed to say it and all that? What's your thoughts around it coming from an Indigenous viewpoint?
Oh, goodness gracious. So from my viewpoint, so this is just my viewpoint. It does not necessarily, here's the caveat, it doesn't represent the views of all Indigenous peoples, because we're all individual people and we're all from our own nations. So from my perspective, it's about the intention that you're using it. If you're using it to describe a person in a situation as an identifier, then I think it can and often is delivered in a derogatory way. So if you're using it as an identification purpose, if we're talking about the Black economy, we're talking about the Indigenous economy. That's the First Nations economy here in Australia. We call it the Black economy. As I said, if in Queensland, through the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, they've developed a program. Their business website is called Black Business Finder. So it's actually saying if you want to work with the Black economy, if you want to engage with a Black business, go to bbf.org.gov.au. So we're actually talking about it in a positive way when we talk about the sector as the Black or the Indigenous business sector. Having said that, I think it really just comes back to how you feel about it and who you're engaging with. As an Indigenous person, I'm going to talk about being, I might say mob. I don't even use a lot of the traditional language that other people do because of my experience and where I've grown up. But for me, the Black economy just is a colloquial way of saying the Indigenous business sector. It's much easier to say. Yeah. So the short answer would be, talking to the person looking at the people that you're with. So if you and I talking about, say, hey, can I call you a Black business? Sure. If you ask somebody else and ask another Indigenous business the same question, they might say, look, actually, I don't really like that term. I prefer First Nations business. That's okay too. So unfortunately, there is no one right answer. Having said that, as we talked offline earlier, McKinsey and Forbes are producing, reports, and their blogs are talking about how to engage in the Black business or the Black economy. And Forbes and McKinsey are using that as a way of describing the opportunity that exists in this sector. So I really think it's about what you're trying to do with it. If it's coming from a place of wanting to engage, wanting to understand and to grow the sector, then I think it's okay. But if it's an individual definition or an individual identifier, then absolutely not.
Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't give you a clearer answer.
No, I think that was just perfect. And I really am so glad that you said right at the beginning there, it's coming from my point of view, not from every Indigenous person's point of view. And that is 100% what we've got to remember with everything, that it's always just one person's opinion.
Yeah, and we are nations. So this is also I think one of the challenges we have. We don't have one homogenous Indigenous people. We have hundreds of nations of countries of Indigenous people in Australia. It's the colonialisation that's created this kind of homogenous view of what an Indigenous person might look like. But the reality is I don't speak for anyone else's country. In fact, I don't even have the right to speak for my own country. There are elders in my community who speak for my country. But I am a member of, I'm a Bundjalung woman because that's my country. But so we, in our culture, have particular people who can talk about country, who can talk about law, who can talk about, all the different, ceremonies and women's business and men's business. I don't play in that space because that's not the space I'm allowed to play in. So we all have to recognize is that as a nation, there are multiple Indigenous nations. So understanding where the person is from and, what their role in that community is, if they are a traditional man or traditional woman who hold a position, who have community obligations, that's really important to understand. But we don't all speak for each other. And these are just my opinions. And I think it's really important because so often we'll have one person's view who is then said that this is the whole view of the Indigenous people. And it never is. It's not, unfortunately, it's not that easy because we are not one people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just beautifully said. Thank you so much. I just love our Friday mornings and our wide range of topics. So next week, our topic is all about the about story on our website, and then how you can actually tell it, what you should put in it. And there's no rules around that. I just want to say that straight off the bat. You can do what you like, but Jenni and I are going to talk about our ideas from a content perspective and a sharing perspective, and then how, of course, you can use that story in so many different ways as your Instagram bio, on Facebook, and posts and all kinds of things. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you about story sharing and story writing. So thank you again for another.
And so where can we find you, Kylie? Tell us how we can lean into you before next Friday if we want to connect.
Jump onto my website, hellomedia.team, or you can find me on Instagram, hellomedia.team, or on Facebook, hellomedia.dreamteam. And of course, join the Hello Media Facebook group because that's where I like to hang out. And at the moment, we've got a visibility challenge going on, which has been really fun watching everybody's posts and just finding ways to get more visible. And again, little prompts in there to help you tell part of your story.
Love it.
So what about you, Jenni? How can people connect with you?
So Elephant in the Room AU on Insta and Facebook are the two places that I hang out the most. And come to my website, eitrconsulting.com. Otherwise, you can find me on LinkedIn. We're on YouTube if you want to watch this back as a replay or the podcast. But if you type in Jenni with an I, Walk with an E, you tend to find me because there's not many of us around. So that's probably the easiest place to find us in Google.
I love how you say Jenni with an I, Walk with an E, and it just rolls off your tongue, because growing up with the surname Mowbray, my dad used to always say, mow as in grass, bray as in donkey.
I love it. I was talking when I was on the radio, doing the radio session yesterday, Bo Spearman, I was like, how do you spell his surname? He's like, it's like spear him without the H. Yes. I was like, I love that. He just was like, I will, like, I can now imagine, and he's this like amazing dude, and I can just imagine him with the spear, like it just fits him so beautifully. And I was just like, yeah, I get it.
I love it when it just rolls off your tongue like that.
I know, right? Well, have an amazing Friday, everyone. Kylie, thank you so much for the chat today. It's been absolutely amazing.
I love chatting with you, Jenni, and that was an awesome topic.
Me too.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking about stories next week.
Have a great week, everyone. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.